Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 97, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. This has been an eventful week. It's a week that I have been looking forward to for the last couple of months, and it exceeded my expectations. I've mentioned before that the store where I teach, the Quilt Gallery here in Kalispell, the owner is just a wonderful, wonderful person. I interviewed her in episode 92. You can go and listen to that. About a year ago, her daughter, Ashley, came on board as the operations manager, and Ashley is an absolute ball of fire. She is fearless and not afraid to try new things. So with her helping out, we have had lots of new fabrics come into the store. She's taken the website to a new level and is handling the social media and doing a fabulous job. And she went to H&H Americas last year, which is the big trade show for sewing and knitting. And while she was there, she convinced Kaffe Fassett and Brandon Mably to come to Kalispell to teach a couple of workshops. And I don't know how she did it, but she kept it under wraps until last spring. And then one day she made an announcement on a Facebook Live post. And as luck would have it, I just happened to have sat down at my computer to check social media about 30 seconds before she went live. So I was one of the first people to hear that Kaffe Fassett and Brandon Mably were coming to Kalispell, and I think I was the first person to sign up for the workshop. I signed up for the economy block quilt workshop. Kaffe and Brandon also taught a diamond quilt workshop, and attendance was limited to 20 people in each workshop. For those of you who may not be old enough, as old as I am, or who may only have been sewing and not knitting, you may not be aware that Kaffe Fassett started out in the textile world as a knitter. His first published design was in Vogue Knitting in 1986. I don't have that particular issue, but I do have some from 88 and later that have interviews with him. But what I remember, because I was a junior in college at the time, and I did a lot of knitting in college, I made sweaters for several of my friends, and one of my friends actually just posted a picture of the sweater that I made her when we were in college. She posted it on Facebook and said that she still had it. So that was a fun thing to see. But I remember what a huge sensation Kaffe Fassett was in the late 80s and throughout the 90s as a knitter. He just did some stunning knit designs, and I never knit one because I looked at them and I thought, I can't do color. And so when I became a knitting designer, I concentrated on Aran sweaters and cable knits because typically they're only done in one color. But I have always had a great admiration for Kaffe's work. And now that he is a fabric designer, I can indulge myself as much as I want. My husband says that I dress like a parrot. I love bright colors. And I have made myself several tops using the Kaffe wide back fabric because it's a lovely cotton sateen. I rather think of myself as being on a campaign to get more people to make garments using Kaffe Fassett collective fabrics because they are just so phenomenal. So you can probably understand my excitement at the fact that Kaffe Fassett was coming to Kalispell, Montana, to our little corner of the world, and that I was able to get a spot in one of the workshops. The workshops were Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. On Monday evening, Kaffe gave a lecture at one of the local high schools, and the store had a pop-up shop before and after the lecture, and I went to help with the pop-up shop. So we got there in the about mid-afternoon and started unpacking quilts and fabrics and pre-cuts and just kits, all sorts of things. We set up a display, and the high school sewing class came and helped us. And do not let anybody tell you that kids are not interested in sewing these days, because this was such a dynamic group of kids, and they are doing such creative things. I got to visit with their teacher for a little bit, and I'm hoping to interview her on the podcast, because I think getting the perspective of someone who is working with the younger generation is going to be fascinating. The sewing class had a display of their own, and I got to visit with one of the kids named Cassidy about her projects, and she has done some really amazing upcycling projects and actually went to a national competition. So we had this pop-up store open from 4:30 until 6:30, and people at 6:30 started filing into the auditorium. At 7 o'clock, Brandon Mably came out, and he and Ashley did a little bit of warm-up and got the audience ready to see Kaffe, and they also handed out all the door prizes, which was great fun. I like Brandon very much. He's a little bit more outgoing than Kaffe. He is a talented designer in his own right and a very good teacher. So I think that they make a good team when they do these workshops. At 7 o'clock, Kaffe came out and gave a lecture called An Eye for Color, where he talked about seeing inspiration for his designs in all sorts of places. He's traveled quite a bit, but even a collection of bottles, which seems rather mundane, can be the inspiration for a design because of the colors. He talked about learning to knit, which is a story that I've heard before, but he visited Scotland with a friend of his and went to a woolen mill where he bought 20 balls of yarn, even though he didn't know how to knit. And on the train back, he asked an older lady to teach him how to knit, and the rest is kind of history from there. Vogue Knitting published his first design in 1986. He's written several books on knitting. I have one called Glorious Knits, which I think may be the first one. And I still do have all of those Vogue Knitting back issues. They're like my Threads back issues. I have all the Threads back issues back to issue number 1 because my mother subscribed to them, and she bequeathed me all of her copies. So yes, I have some magazines that I treasure, and I was able to go back and look at some of Kaffe's early designs. I believe he and Brandon met and started working together in 1990. Kaffe also does needlework, needlepoint. It's just interesting to me that there were a lot of us who started out as knitters who have moved over into sewing or weaving or other textile crafts. Kaffe took questions for about 20 minutes at the end of the lecture, and then he and Brandon went out and signed books for everyone in the lobby. Marianne, who owns the store, told the staff later that they had cut over 300 yards of fabric in the 2+ hours that the pop-up shop was open. And in fact, at least a dozen of the bolts were completely sold out even before the workshops began. We had been given a supply list for the workshop, and interestingly, we didn't do any sewing in the workshop. This was all about choosing fabric and layout. So we were encouraged to bring some fabric in small, medium, and large prints in a colorway. I went through my stash, and my stash is pretty extensive, but I didn't find the kinds of fabrics that I ended up using in my quilt during the workshop. So I went to the store fully prepared to just buy whatever I needed. I took my cutting mat and a rotary cutter and a few other supplies. And when I got to the classroom, Brandon asked me what fabrics I had brought, and I showed him. But I said, I'm fully prepared to go shopping. And he called Kaffe over and said, here's one who needs to get fabric. So Kaffe and I walked out into the store, and he said, what color do you want to use? And I think I surprised him a bit because I said I want to do a yellow quilt. I guess that purples and greens and blues and maybe pinks and reds tend to be the most popular choices for students in these classes, but I love yellow and I can't wear it. It makes me look like death warmed over. Winter coloring and yellow or orange do not play well together. So I wanted to make a yellow quilt. And all of a sudden, it was like somebody had turned on a switch and Kaffe started pulling bolts of fabric off the shelves, and he was not pulling his fabric. We went all the way through the store, and I ended up with 14 bolts of fabrics, probably half of which were batiks. Amazingly enough, I never work with batiks. But there were some retina burning prints that Kaffe pulled, and some of them were true yellows, some of them were more green yellows, and some of them were more orange yellows. And he said, get a half a yard of each. So I headed for the cutting table, and the girls at the store were right on top of everything. They were cutting fabric all day long for everybody, and they told us, leave your bolts here, we will cut the fabric and we will deliver it to you in the classroom. They didn't want us to miss a minute of the classes. I will tell you that I am the kind of student that gets a little bit nervous when I don't know what is happening or where I'm going. And we didn't get a lot of instruction. Or should I say, we got instruction, but it was doled out breadcrumb style. And I think that was brilliant on the part of Kaffe and Brandon, because they didn't want us to make Kaffe and Brandon quilts. They wanted us to learn to develop our own style, our own aesthetic. So we were getting information, but then we had to take that information and figure out what to do with it. As I said, that approach sometimes makes me a bit uncomfortable, but I am also, I think, old enough and mature enough to tamp down those feelings of anxiety and go with what I'm supposed to do. So we were told to cut 11-inch squares and alternate them on our design wall. So the store had put up design walls, which were basically 2-yard lengths of a gray flannel with a white grid on it. And I suspect Kaffe has Free Spirit print that fabric specifically for him in his workshops. He said it's the best-selling fabric in the Free Spirit line. So actually on Monday morning, I had stopped in at the store and asked if I could help out, and I cut a lot of those design walls. So there were 20 of those hanging up around the room, and each student had one. So we were told to cut 11-inch squares and put them up on our design wall in checkerboard style, where we alternated light fabric with dark fabric. And that is not as straightforward as it sounds, because in my case especially, it was hard to tell what was light and what was dark. It was a matter of figuring out what was light relative to something else, or what was dark relative to something else. And I should note that at the beginning of class, Brandon and Kaffe made a point of saying that they have never formally studied color theory, that everything that they were teaching us was learned through experience, which was quite a contrast from the Juicy Juice, the Giuseppe Robato lecture that I attended earlier in the month, because Giuseppe talked a lot about color theory. So it was interesting to compare and contrast those two approaches to choosing and using colors. And I'm not going to say which one I think is better or worse, because I don't think either of them is better or worse. They are tools in a toolbox. Once we had a checkerboard up on our design wall of about 3 squares wide by maybe 4 squares long, 5 squares long. We were instructed to start cutting 8-inch squares, and those were put on point on top of the 11-inch squares. So this is the economy block workshop, and if you can visualize an economy block, it is a square within a square within a square. The goal with the 8-inch blocks was to arrange them so that they provided some contrast to the 11-inch squares below them. And it got a little hairy for me doing this, because there were places where I was putting a greenish yellow square on top of an orange yellow square, and part of my brain kept screaming no, and part of my brain kept screaming, well, let's see what happens. And I basically told the rational part of my brain that it needed to go take a nap. Throughout all of this, Kaffe and Brandon were walking around the room, looking at people's design walls and giving suggestions, and I found it incredibly hilarious that Kaffe and Brandon sometimes gave contradicting advice and information. And part of me even wondered if they were doing that on purpose, just to get people to think and to come to conclusions for themselves. Once the 8-inch squares were on top of the 11-inch squares, we had to find an accent fabric to use for our 5-inch squares. And if you look at the economy quilt blocks in Kaffe's book, Quilts in London, you'll see that for each of the centers for the 5-inch blocks, he used a large flower. So he and I went out again to shop and look at fabrics, and he pulled 4 different bolts and said, see which one of these you like best. One was black with colorful flowers on it. One was, I think, a purple. And there were a couple of others, and he said that he really liked the idea of using the black background with the bright flowers. So I got a yardish of that fabric and went back and was cutting out flowers. But I should also say that my design wall happened to be positioned by the door to the shop. So I had a lot of the shop staff coming back to look at my quilt, and it got to the point where it was almost quilt design by committee, because several people were making suggestions about what they thought should happen. And I was at the point where I was like, sure, let's try it. So I was throwing a whole bunch of different things up there. And Brandon didn't really like the black flower or the black fabric with the flowers idea. He kind of nixed that. So when it came time to break for lunch, I didn't actually have any black fabric with flowers on it. I had a lot of other stuff. We were given an hour for lunch from 12:30 to 1:30, and we were also given very strict instructions that we were not allowed to come back into the classroom until lunch was over. And that was for a couple of reasons. One being that they wanted us to kind of clear our brains and be able to come back with a fresh eye. And the other was that at the end of the lunch period, Kaffe and Brandon went through the classroom and looked at each quilt and conferred with each other and made some suggestions. So when I came back into the classroom after lunch, there were some black squares on my quilt. And from what I understand, that was a bit of a point of contention. So I decided at that moment that I probably wasn't going to make a decision about the center squares until I got home and I could put the quilt back up on my design wall and take a look at it. By that point in the class, all of the students were very comfortable with each other, and my two table mates and I were swapping fabrics because buying fabrics for fussy cutting can get expensive, and each of us had plenty to share, so we were passing around pieces of fabric and going to look at each other's quilts, and that was a lot of fun. I was really happy to see that people were being so generous, and some of those black squares with flowers ended up in other people's quilts, which was fun. We had to then pick out an inner border and an outer border, and I love both my inner border and outer border. The inner border is a geometric pattern, and the outer border is a big floral pattern. You will probably see pictures of this quilt on Instagram in the next week or so, but if you want to see them now, they are up on my blog at my website, which is www.janetzabo.com, so you can pop over there and take a look at them there. At the very end of the class, Kaffe took about the last half an hour and walked around the room and stopped at every single quilt and gave a little assessment and critique. He always had something very positive to say, but he didn't hold back on where he thought things needed to change, and that was helpful to hear. You don't learn anything if the teacher tells you that everything is perfect. And it gave all of us who were in the class a chance to take a deep breath and look at what everybody else had been doing. And there were some absolutely stunning designs. Class was over at 4:30, and I was packing my stuff up when I got an invitation to dinner with Kaffe and Brandon and the rest of the store staff. So we all got to spend about 2.5 hours together visiting and talking about fabric and design and just all sorts of interesting things. It was a much more relaxed atmosphere, and we had a good time. So that was Tuesday. On Wednesday, because I didn't have to go anywhere, I put my quilt up on my design wall, and I decided what to do with those center squares. And I went back to the black fabric with the bright flowers on it. That was what the quilt wanted, and I was not going to argue. I did have to run back to the store mid-afternoon to grab a little bit more fabric, and while I was there, I got to take a peek at what the students in the Wednesday class were doing. And they were making the diamond quilt from Quilts in London, and it was phenomenal just to see all the beautiful fabrics. In both classes, Kaffe said, you don't have to use strictly my fabric. You can use anything in the store. One woman had done a design using only Aboriginal prints, which was just, it was mind-blowing. I had to go to help set up for our craft co-op sale, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I didn't get to work on the quilt anymore last night. I got it laid out, and this morning when I woke up, I got to work putting the blocks together, and I found that because we had used 11-inch and 8-inch squares, I was able to cut those squares in such a way to make my economy blocks that I actually have enough of those 8 and 12-inch pieces. I have enough of the units to make an identical quilt. All I have to do is find different 5-inch centers for it. So that was a little bit of serendipity, and I probably will do a second quilt. It may have different centers and different borders, but I feel like I'm already halfway there, so it seems silly not to put together another quilt. So I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Kaffe and Brandon, learning from them, getting to know them. My week is not over yet. As I mentioned, our craft co-op is having its annual sale on Friday and Saturday. I did not go to help out today. I don't have anything in the sale, So technically I don't have to go and help, but it's a group that I enjoy being part of, and I want to see the sale being successful. It also happens to be held at the church that I attend, so I'm kind of the point person for figuring out where things are in the church. I will help out tomorrow morning as one of the cashiers. I will be there for the cleanup portion, again, because I go to that church and I know where everything goes, so it's helpful for me to be there when we're cleaning up. But I've had an awful lot of peopling this week, so I needed some time to myself. And I know a lot of you have sent me feedback and mentioned that you like hearing about things happening here on the homestead. It's not all what you see on Instagram. Some of it is pretty dull. So this afternoon, right after I finish recording this podcast, I have to go out and sort potatoes. My husband and I dug up all the potatoes last weekend right before it rained, and they've been in a trailer wagon. The wagon for my John Deere tractor is sitting outside, and it's full of potatoes. And I have to sort them into burlap bags so that we can put them in the root cellar. But I think today is going to be our last really spectacular day. It's close to 80 and the sun is shining, so it won't be a hardship to sit out on the porch and sort potatoes. After this, I think we're going to get a little more fall-like weather. It's supposed to be in the 60s and 70s, and maybe not quite as sunny. I've got about half of my Kaffe class quilt put together. I'm hoping to get it finished this weekend and get the borders on it so that I can find a backing and start quilting it. I've got a few other projects in the works. I'm actually almost finished with my Can Do Patterns retro sling bag. I literally just have to sew the front and the back to the gusset, which I can sew the front to the gusset, but then I need to bind the seams, and I am waiting for some binding to come from Sailrite, so that project may have to go into timeout until the binding arrives. I have quite a few new pieces of Kaffe Fassett collective fabric to add to the stash, some of which may become garments. Brandon pulled one of the wide backs off the shelf at the store because somebody wanted to use it for the backing on their quilt. And as he was bringing it in the classroom, he stopped and he said to me, "This would make a great dress." And I said, "Yes, it would. I already have 2 yards of it at home in the stash to make a dress." So I will get back to doing some garment sewing here before too long. I have no shortage of projects to keep me busy. I need to get the canning done. I've got to make tomato sauce and salsa and can pumpkin for future pumpkin pies. But now that the garden is pretty much done and we're in cooler weather, I don't feel guilty about sewing at all. So my sewing time from now until next March is going to be the focus of my days. Okay, and now the usual housekeeping. Just a reminder that our 100th episode is coming up in a couple of weeks. I've gotten quite a few listener questions, and I suspect I may end up doing 2 listener question episodes. So thank you so much to everyone who has asked such great questions. Thanks for the emails and the feedback and the suggestions. I really appreciate all of it. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. You can use the fan mail feature. I love to see new ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Again, you can wait for things to show up on Instagram, but you can also pop over to the blog, which is at my website, www.janetzabo.com. Links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and the podcast website. I post on the blog 3 to 4 times a week, depending on what's going on. So I'm off to go sort potatoes. I'll be at our craft co-op sale tomorrow and Saturday. and church on Sunday, and then I hope to get some more sewing done. So until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.